Hi, Tatiana.
Hello.
Now tell us, why do you write?
I write because I live, and in order to live, I write, and to write, I live. That's my life.
When did you start writing?
I started writing when I was 10 years old. I was the child of immigrants. Both my parents worked, and the people where we lived, the apartment where we lived, did not want me to play outside. And my parents, in order not to lose their apartment, locked me in the summer and took away the television, so I couldn't watch television. I could only read or write. They did give me a present. They gave me a typewriter. I had a typewriter at 10. Not everybody has one. And so I started writing. And the book I wrote then reflects in some ways both the Zorro episodes of the time, which I watched when my parents were home, but also how I felt, because it is called Against Her Will. I was locked up against my will.
Little do they know that they had given you probably the best present any little girl could get.
Absolutely. This was the best present that one could have, because it took me away from where I was. It took me into the world where I could say what I wanted to say, even at the age of 10, without hurting anyone, and yet saying everything I needed to say.
What have you written so far?
I've written many books. I've written books in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s, in the 2000s. I write about 2 books per decade. And so I've written books about college, I've written books about work, I've written books about the international life, all those. That's what I've written so far.
Which was your first book?
My first book was Against Her Will, which I wrote again at the age of 10. That was my first book. And then I wrote a book called From Anya to Eve, or to Eve from Anya, actually, which was a love story based, in fact, on an idea that I had from the very famous 1960s book, Love Story. But I created a different type of love story. So that was the start of it. Then I wrote Before They Cut the Ivy, which was about American universities, the system that existed in the 1960s before it disappeared. And that was before the Ivy League became coeducational. So that's how it started. I have always been an insider and outsider, looking at every aspect of life from where I live, but as an outsider.
Now, why didn't you try to publish before?
Well, one of the things that you don't want to do is you don't want to write things about the jobs you are doing, because you know that people won't keep you in those jobs. No organization wants to be told what it does from the inside out. You will lose your job. So that was one of the reasons I didn't write about the things I did internationally. But I did try to publish Before They Cut the Ivy. In fact, Mount Holyoke gave me a literary agent. Unfortunately, this literary agent, who helped me very much, he taught me to concentrate on a few characters instead of going from right to left. He disappeared, and so I could not publish it. But that was the best thing that would happen, because 50 years after the fact, the story of the 1960s and the kind of system we had then is much more important for the young women and the young men today who don't know about that system, who don't understand their grandmothers, even their grandfathers, a very different system that existed in America.
Besides that, what made you publish now?
Because if I don't publish now, when will I publish? And it is the right time, because of the fact that I just mentioned, that young people today do not understand their parents or their grandparents. This is obvious in the way we treat people who still behave the ways that were accepted as late as the 1990s. I'm thinking really of men more than women, because women are now going after men for behaviors which were accepted basically by society in the 1990s, up to the 1990s.
And who do you hope will read your novels?
I hope very much that people, young people, men and women both, will read these novels, the people in their 20s, even teenagers, it's certain, not all the books, but certain of the books, and people between 30 and 40, people who were born in 1990 and afterwards, because they do not know what the 1960s, the 1970s, the 1980s were like. And for the novels I've written after that, that is because I deal with historic facts, and I want them to see it not through history books, but through people and what they did and how they lived and their decisions and the impact those decisions have on their young lives today.
What else do you hope to accomplish with your novels?
I hope to teach people history. We do not teach enough history in our schools these days. We do not think it is important. And yet, knowing the past helps us not make mistakes in the future. It helps us not repeat the same things we did in the past. And the past is not like the present. There are differences, but there are enough lessons in the past so that we do not repeat things unnecessarily.
And what do you emphasize in your novels, such as The World Through the Heart?
I emphasize that everything is based on people. It is not based on events. There are some events, of course, that play a big part. For instance, if you have the eruption of a volcano, that is not a person-driven event. However, people react to it. To me, everything is because we care for the people close to us, because we do fall in love. The basic thing that happens in human life is that we love certain things and we do not love other things, that we are close to certain people and not as close to other people, and that defines our lives even more than we would like to admit. That is very important. That's what I want to show people, that everything is done through people.
Now, what about older love? That sounds very intriguing.
Well, the thing is, we are living much longer now. We're not living 40 years. The average lifespan, for instance, even in the United States, in 1900 was 47. Now the average lifespan is nearing 80, which means that we usually do not stay with our first loves because we outgrow them, we change. We do not grow the same way the person who we're with grows. And so therefore we fall in love, or we start loving someone. I don't like the word fall in love. We start loving someone who is very different from the person that we loved when we were 20. And that is why older love is different. And it is a love that's different because it's a love that knows all kinds of downfalls. It knows the things that have not happened that we wanted to happen. It knows what the limits are, that we have dreams, but we cannot fulfill all of our dreams. That is older love. It's more reasonable, and yet it is beautiful.
Which leads me to the next question. What about aspects of love?
Well, there are different aspects of love. I have, in one of my forthcoming books, which I have not yet published, I deal with two parts of love. One is called Eros, the other is Agape. Eros is obviously romantic love. It's the love of the body, it's also the love of the spirit, but it is romantic love. While Agape is more compassionate love. It also includes our love for our families, our love for our children, but if you don't have those two aspects of love in a relationship, the relationship will falter. So that's why I have dealt with those two aspects of love. And in the forthcoming book, which may be published in a couple of months or maybe only in a year or so, the first volume is called Eros and the second volume is called Agape. That's a subtitle. It has another title, but I won't go into the title for now.
Why the emphasis on the international system, the United Nations?
Well, that's because that's what I lived. I base my novels on truths. I invent people, I invent situations, but everything that I have is based on truths. If I mention a place, it is the place as it was at the time. If I mention an event, it is the event that occurred at the time, and all my characters are built around events. And I lived the international life. I worked for the United Nations. I worked as an interpreter, then as a development person. Then I worked as a high-level advisor. I did all kinds of things for the UN. Very unusual for the one person to do the different things that I did at the UN. So I saw different aspects. And this made it possible for me to bring out various aspects in the books. And I want people to understand the UN not through the diplomatic words that come out of the UN or the coverage that the UN receives through the press. I want people to understand the UN through the people that actually work in the United Nations, because the United Nations is made up of people with their strong points, with their weak points, with their ability to blend in with certain situations and their inability to do so, and therefore not be able to carry out what they're supposed to do.
What made you join the United Nations?
Oh, that goes back to the 1950s. The 1950s, we started having public television. And one of the interesting things in Passaic, New Jersey, where I grew up in America, was that Channel 13 used to cover the debates in the United Nations. Our channels don't do that anymore. And I saw Henry Cabot Lodge, who was our ambassador at that time in the late 1950s. And I saw the Soviet ambassador at the same time. And here were two enemies, and yet they treated each other civilly. They had incredible differences, but they did so as human beings. They talked to each other, with each other. And I said, if we can do that, that's where I want to be. I want to be where we treat each other as human beings, not as the enemy. I've started out very differently. I started out as an interpreter, not because I wanted to be an interpreter, but because in the 1970s, it was very hard for a woman to be a professional in the UN. I was, for instance, a candidate for a position in the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna. We had 46 candidates. I was one of the 3 finalists. And I was told by our representative in Paris at the time, because that's where my interviews took place, I was told, you're 23, you will get married, you will leave us. We will have spent a great deal of time training you and hoping for you to become someone, an important person dealing with the International Atomic Agency matters, and you won't do it. So this is something that would not happen today. Things have changed enormously, but that is what was the case in the 1970s. Then I went on to become an interpreter because of that, but I left it and went back after I went back to school in order to get away from interpretation. I didn't have to, but I went to another graduate school, one of our best, called the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and went back to the United Nations Development Program. And it's a whole story. I did all kinds of things. I wound up, the most incredible thing, with the man who had co-founded the United Nations Development Program and worked with him for 10 years, doing high-level missions.
I'm sure some of those are very dangerous.
Oh yes, I've seen little things in my life. I've been under, I've stayed in a hotel where there was bombs going all around, and I was the only one who was not phased. For some reason, I, who usually get excited about things, do not get excited when danger is around. It's like in an airplane once over Ethiopia. The door opened, and everybody was retching, excuse me for using that word, and I just sat back there. I said, oh, how interesting. The door has opened. So, I mean, I guess that in those types of situations, I have a very, what the French would call sang-froid, cold blood, that is really good because I can look forward, I can find a way out if there is a way out.
Tatiana, thank you so much.
Thank you.